Eighth graders, it is April 1st. Seems like an April Fool's Day with all the goofiness that we've got surrounding us. Um, Today we're going to go through Lee surrendering to Grant. So after 4 years of war, starting at Fort Sumter in 1861 and ending at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, we're finally going to have this thing over with. Um, and then we'll end up with Lincoln's assassination, finishing most, if not all, of Chapter 17. Tomorrow, my goal is to do a Zoom review, but very limited access at home for internet. We've pretty much ran out. So if we don't have a review, just watch for a message on um, Google Classroom for what you should do next. Your test will be on Friday. Please pay attention to those things. And before you email me questions about what is our assignment, watch the videos. It's getting a little bit ridiculous with some of you. So, and I know not all of you watch the videos, but if that's the case, then your expectation to do well in class probably won't be very good. You do have an assignment. Complete at least half of your study guide by Thursday. The whole thing will be due on Friday. Do not submit it until I tell you to, please. So the plan for today moving forward. We'll see how quickly I can get through this. There's a lot of material, so hang on tight and pay attention. And if you have questions, feel free to email me about the material. So the other day, yesterday, we talked about Sherman's march to the sea and how tough he was, and how that was kind of setting up for a clash on Richmond with Sherman and General Grant sort of surrounding General Lee. So he's in pursuit. Grant's slogan at this point: whatever happens, we will not retreat. So this is what Lincoln's been pushing for with all these hesitators and generals that were never quite prepared to attack. This is what Lincoln was looking for: whatever happens, we will not retreat. So he gets battles at victories at battles of Wilderness, a battle of Spotsylvania, the Battle of Cold Harbor. Huge numbers of casualties, but we will not retreat. So now Richmond is under siege by April 3rd, 1865. So almost the anniversary of the siege of Richmond. The Union captures the city and burns much of it. By April 9th, Lee has been chased out of Richmond, of course, when the city is captured, and he has struggled his way to a place called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. It's the name of a small town. On April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant, and the Civil War is over. So the story kind of goes like this. General Lee knows his army is done. The capital has fallen. The blockade, the Anaconda, has held up strong throughout the 4 years of fighting. The Mississippi has been captured. The Union really has the Confederacy on the ropes. They're wobbling. They're almost ready to fall. They can barely hold on, and it's pretty much over. So at this point, Lee decides it's time to surrender. There's no other option. He's going to save what's left of his army and get this thing over with. So he sends a courier to find Grant. The courier meets with one of Grant's men and says Lee would like to meet with Grant on April 9th, 1865, in the town of Appomattox Courthouse. So they're walking through town. Grant sends a couple of men to find a place that would be suitable for this. And by this time, most of Appomattox is abandoned because they can see two gigantic armies camped outside of town, and they've seen what's happened to other towns throughout the war. So they're walking through town looking at the storefront, sort of picture Washington Street downtown, and imagine what that would look like abandoned. And they're trying to find a place where these two generals can meet, along with their adjutants and their other generals and people of importance. And they're not having much luck until they run into a guy named Wilmer McLean. Wilmer was an older gentleman. He was a shopkeeper by trade, but he was retired. So he's probably, I would guess, in his 60s. And they run into Wilmer, and Wilmer didn't really take sides during the Civil War. He was a Virginian, but he wasn't a Confederate. So they run into this guy, and Wilmer says, "How about this shop over here?" And he opens it up, and they're like, "Oh, this is nice, but it's kind of small, and we need something more deserving of the relevance of the bigness of this event." So Wilmer kind of scratches his head, and he goes, "Well, okay, I've got a house right up the street here. It's pretty nice. You could use my parlor." So he takes these men there, and they're like, "Oh, this is great. We'll be there tomorrow morning." Here's the funny thing about Wilmer McLean. He actually lived at a place called Manassas Junction in 1861. Manassas Junction. In fact, the first fighting of the Civil War started in Wilmer McLean's property. So Wilmer and his wife, being older, decided to move away from where the hot spots of fighting took place, and they moved to Appomattox, Virginia, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. So ironically enough, the war starts in Wilmer McLean's backyard, and it ends in his parlor, which is kind of a fancy word for a living room. So on the morning of April 9th, 1865, Lee shows up first. And he's dressed to the nines. He's a good-looking dude. Got a press suit. He's clean. His beard's been trimmed, and he sits stone bolt upright position with his polished sword. Here comes Grant. Grant walks in, sits down, slumps a little bit late. He's dirty. He's wearing a uniform he's been wearing for several days. If you looked at an image of this, you would never know that Grant was the winner. So they sit down at a table. This is McLean's house. It has actually been reconstructed. I believe it was destroyed in a fire, but it's been rebuilt. It's sitting in Appomattox Courthouse. And this is kind of the image that we see. Now remember, Grant, even though he's been chasing Lee, has respect for this guy, and he knows that now is the time for healing to start. It's not time to point your finger at him and say, "Ha ha, I told you so, sucker. We defeated you. You're a loser." No, now's the time when things have to get better. So Grant talks to Lee. Lee says, "Sir, I have a couple of requests. My men are starving. They haven't eaten for days since we left Richmond." So before their meeting is even over, Grant sends men to order the Union soldiers to give supplies and rations to the Confederates. So this is the beginning of the healing process. This is an unconditional surrender, which means Grant gets to pick the terms of the surrender. Lee doesn't get to choose anything. It is over. In fact, Grant, by this point, had earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, U.S. Grant, Ulysses Simpson Grant. So Lee knows he's got to take what's given to him. So he says, "What do we need to do, sir?" And Grant basically says, this is in my words, this is the dummied down version. Grant basically says, I'm going to let your men keep their horses, which is unheard of in victory. Usually the winners get the horses. But because these men are going to be going home to their farms, they're going to need horses to rebuild the country. So again, the healing process. He even goes as far as to say, I'm going to allow your men to keep their rifles. Turn in their handguns. They don't need those, but keep their rifles, because when they get home, they're going to have to feed themselves. So this is very kind and generous terms that he's collecting from the Confederacy, which also might help set Grant up for a future in politics as he decides to run for president later. So when this is over, this is Wilmer's living room. Pretty nice place. Beautiful rugs, carpets. There's paintings on the wall chairs. When this is over, Grant gets up and walks out. When Lee gets up and walks out, all of the Union soldiers who are kind of just sitting in the yard and hanging around, they stand up and salute General Lee. Again, a symbol of respect. All of these men in the background, mostly Union soldiers with a couple of Confederates mixed in, they look around and they think, we've just witnessed one of the most momentous occasions in American history. They want a souvenir. So they rob Wilmer McLean blind. I'm taking this chair. They take all of this stuff. I'm taking this picture. They take the stuff off the fireplace. Every one of those men wanted a souvenir. So what do we see as a legacy of the war? 4 years of fighting, about 360,000 dead Union soldiers and 260,000 dead Confederates. Even though the Union wins, their numbers are much worse. Another 375,000 wounded. Total casualties of almost 1 million men killed or wounded in the Civil War. So way bigger than what anybody had expected at the beginning of this thing. Remember, there were people that said they would drink the blood of all those that were killed, or they would eat the bodies of those that were slain. So they were all very, very wrong. The South was in ruins. Almost half of their livestock was killed. Half of their machinery destroyed. Their railroads were torn up. We talked about that in yesterday's video. So only a few days later, so the war ends on April 9th. So you would think that now Abraham Lincoln could take a breath and sort of breathe a sigh of relief, but that's unfortunately not the case. He's still working really hard because now he sees the hard part beginning to heal the nation that's been torn apart by this war. So he's waking up early. It's 5 days later after the surrender. Lincoln's working his tail off. And just to give you a breakdown on the day of his assassination, I'll try to keep this brief. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Lincoln gets up. So he's not an early guy, but that's not really late, and he works in his office for about an hour. He calls his secretary to order a cabinet meeting at 11 o'clock to get all of his advisors, and he invites General Grant. One of the most important advisors is guy's name was William Seward. He was the Secretary of State. He had a carriage accident, sort of like a car accident, and he was confined to bed, so he wasn't going to be there. At 8 o'clock, Lincoln ate breakfast just as he would normally. His normal breakfast was 1 egg and 1 cup of coffee. And Mary sat with him at breakfast, his wife, and she was a little nuts. We'll talk about that on another day. But she said, imagine, she'd been the wife of the president during the Civil War, where he had very little time at home and no entertainment, and it's sort of like being sequestered in our homes for this coronavirus outbreak that we're living through right now, sort of quarantined to home. She'd suffered the death of one of her children, and one of her sons was fighting in the Union Army. So Mary was a mess. And so she's like, we're going out tonight. And when your wife says, we're going out tonight, you're going out. So she tells Lincoln she has tickets to Grover's Theater for the night of April 14th. But she says, I'd rather go at a Ford's Theater because there's a production of a play called Our American Cousin, which was a comedy. So, yeah, they've had rough times. Let's laugh a little bit and have a good time. So, of course, Lincoln, being the president, can pull some strings and get them box seats at Ford's Theater for Our American Cousin. And she says, invite General Grant and Mrs. Grant. So the president takes care of that. They get to the War Department, and General Grant tells Secretary of War Edwin Stanton that the Grants were going to decline the offer. It wasn't out of disrespect to Lincoln. It was because Mrs. Grant couldn't stand Mrs. Lincoln and didn't want to sit with her. So they invited another couple who also declined to sit with them. I don't know, maybe they thought there was something going on. By 10 o'clock in the morning, word was sent to Ford's Theater that the president was coming, so they're jacked. And at the time when word gets to Ford's Theater, there's a guy there, John Wilkes Booth, collecting his mail. Booth is an actor, so it's not unusual for him to be at a theater. And that's where he got his mail, actually, not at his house. So he hears this plan, and he comes up with a strategy with a couple of co-conspirators to simultaneously assassinate President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward, along with a couple of others at the same time. The other guys all chicken out, but Booth follows through, and they don't get to William Seward because he's laid up in his bed. By 6 o'clock, the Lincoln family eats, and Mary tells Abraham that a young couple named Clara Harris and Major Henry Rathbone were accepting their invitation to Ford's Theater, so they're kind of excited, a couple of no-names. By 7 o'clock, William Cook, the president's bodyguard, was relieved 3 hours late by a second bodyguard named John Parker. Parker was told to be on hand at Ford's Theater when the presidential party got there. Crook said, "Good night, Mr. President." Lincoln responded, "Goodbye, Crook." It's almost like Lincoln knew something was going to happen, because Crook said this is the first time Lincoln had ever said goodbye. He had always said good night to Mr. Crook. So a few hours later, 8 o'clock p.m., they get at Ford's Theater about 8:30. The play had already begun. The doorkeeper, the ticket collector, greeted the honored guests and led them to the president's suite. And they stopped in the middle of the play and played "Hail to the Chief," During the play's intermission, Parker, the bodyguard that had replaced Mr. Crook, left the theater and went next door to the tavern for a drink, leaving the president unguarded. Well, during the day, Booth had had plenty of time to think about this, and he had decided that it would be a great time to attack. So Booth had set it up so that he could go down the narrow hallway to the president's suite. He drilled a small hole in the door so he could see exactly where the president was sitting, and he knew exactly what he was doing. At 10 o'clock that night, Booth came up behind Lincoln busted in at a time when there was a laugh track in the play, so everyone, ha ha ha, everyone was laughing. Booth knew the play inside and out. He knew every word of it, so he popped in just at the right time. He jumps from behind Lincoln and shoots him in the back of the head at point-blank range. The bullet entered his head 3 inches behind his left ear and went 7.5 inches into his brain. Lincoln slumps over. Rathbone jumps out of his seat at the same time as Booth shouts the word freedom. Many accounts even saying Booth yelled in Latin, "Sic semper tyrannis," or "Death be to tyrants." Rathbone jumped up to grab Booth, and as he jumped up, Booth slashed at him with a knife, cutting Rathbone's arm. He leaped 11 feet to the stage, broke his leg, so he's crawling off the stage, kind of dragging himself. And everyone at this point is screaming because Mrs. Lincoln is freaking out. Booth escapes out the back door and jumps onto a horse and escapes with a friend. So they're gone. There is a 23-year-old doctor in the crowd. He sees that Lincoln's wound is mortal. It's impossible for him to recover, which means he's going to die. They carry his body across the street to a boarding house, kind of like a hotel. And it's not until 7:22 in the morning when Lincoln finally passes away. So the guy survives from 10 o'clock at night until 7 o'clock in the morning with a bullet in his head. In fact, his doctor may have hastened his death slightly by sticking his small finger in the bullet wound to probe the depth of the wound. By 10 o'clock that morning, President Johnson, or Andrew Johnson, is sworn in as President of the United States. So that's kind of a short version of Lincoln's assassination. Our economy, as a result of the war, begins to transform, and we begin to see more industry replacing agriculture. The 13th Amendment is ratified, and 4 million slaves have to be brought into the national lifestyle. This is a picture of Ford's Theater after Lincoln's death. Notice the black bunting. Black is always a symbol of mourning. This is Ford's Theater today. So if you were to visit Washington, D.C., you definitely want to visit Ford's Theater. So then, now, not very different. Really looks about the same, apparently from a different angle. And this is kind of a depiction of what it might have looked like. Here's Major Rathbone and Clara Harris and Mrs. Lincoln and Mr. Lincoln. This is the suite. This is what it looks like today if you visit Ford's Theater. I don't think you get to visit this part. At least I didn't when I was there. So here's where the president was, overlooking the stage and the theater. Kind of a beautiful place. And here's the boarding house where the president passed away. Here's the bed they put him in. Remember, President Lincoln was 6'3". The bed was only like 5'9" or something. So even in death, he was uncomfortable. His legs would have been hanging off the end. This is John Wilkes Booth. By morning of the next day, 1,000 Union troops were looking around Washington, D.C. A $100,000 reward was placed on the head of the killer, and all warships in the area were ordered to the coast of Maryland looking for the killer. It was the biggest manhunt in American history. And here's the path that Booth takes. He leaves Ford's Theater, stops at Surratt's Tavern to pick up some weapons. Mary Surratt was a conspirator, which means she helped in this. Stops at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd in the middle of the night to have his leg set. Mudd would later be sentenced to life in prison for fixing Booth. That sentence would later be stopped, so he was set free. They stop at the home of Samuel Cox to seek some help. Slept in the woods, home of Lieutenant Colonel Hughes. They accidentally showed up there. They ended up at Lucas's farm. Showed up April 24th at Garrett's farm, where they sleep in a tobacco drying barn, where they're caught up with on April 26th. When they're caught, John Booth is shot through a gap in the barn as they begin setting it on fire to try to smoke him out, basically. So what happens? Powell, Harold Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt were all sentenced to death. These were co-conspirators or helpers. O'Laughlin, Arnold, and Mudd received life sentences. A guy named Spangler got a 6-year prison term. So a lot of people were involved in helping with this. It wasn't just John Wilkes Booth. These guys were eventually pardoned by Johnson because it was determined that they didn't necessarily help someone they thought was a killer. O'Laughlin died of yellow fever in prison in 1867. John Surratt, Mary's son, was captured in Egypt in 1866 and released. So he lived until 1916 with no punishment. This is the train that carried Lincoln from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. Notice it's got a picture of him and it's all decorated up. And here's the funeral car that would stop in every town. So you can see that it took from April 19th all the way till May 4th just to get to Springfield to bury him. And remember, he was the first to be embalmed, so his body wasn't rotting. There's his casket. And that ends for us chapter 17, which will lead us into chapter 17 test. So hopefully on Thursday I can get a Zoom working from home with our internet issues, and we'll do a Kahoot together. If not, I'll put some sort of review in Google Classroom, and the test will be in Schoology on Friday. You guys have a great day. I know this was a long one. I appreciate you hanging in there. If you have questions or want me to elaborate on the story, we can talk about it during Zoom on Thursday, or I can set up a separate Zoom some other time. You guys have a wonderful day. Get some fresh air. Stay healthy. Stay safe.